The Muggle Death Eater and His Daughter by Great 78. Chapter 42. Depository and Disclosure. The middle of March, 1998. Narcissa and Linda settled themselves with their take-out containers of curry on the small settee next to Tonks's bed.
"So, what's all this about, Nymphadora?"
Narcissa asked, spearing a piece of buttered chicken with her fork. Tonks tore herself away from salivating over the remainder of her meal of Rogan Josh. "The upshot of it is this," she began. "There are certain objects that you-know-who has hidden that are important to his cause. The Order needs to find them and destroy them. I believe he may have given one of these objects to Bellatrix many years ago. Of the three of us, you know her best, Aunt Narcissa. Where would she have hidden such an object?"
Narcissa put down her fork, lost in thought. "I don't believe she has it with her. Bellatrix is too paranoid. If this is something important to her Dark Lord, it would be kept somewhere under lock and key. She is rather nomadic these days. Many days she's at Malfoy Manor, although occasionally she remembers her husband and goes to Maison Lestrange."
"Do you think it could be there?" asked Linda.
"I don't believe so. Bellatrix has a lot of disdain for Rodolphus and his brother. She wouldn't entrust either of them with such an object."
Narcissa tore a piece of naan bread in half, and daintily nibbled a bit of it, swallowing before speaking again.
"No, for centuries, families like the Blacks and the Lestranges only trust one place more than any other for security."
Narcissa's eyes met her niece's, and they said together, "Gringotts." "That's the bank in Diagon Alley, yes?" "Are you proposing we rob a bank?" Linda asked, eyebrows raised in surprise.
"I wasn't,"
said Narcissa with wide eyes. "I was," Tonks said, with a spark in her voice. After another Wednesday night strategy meeting, their plan was coming together, and not a moment too soon. The time for Tonks to deliver was fast approaching, and Linda was overjoyed the next Monday to receive a message informing her that baby Edward Remus Lupin had been born healthy over the weekend. Narcissa said the little family was doing quite well, and that they could go and see her and the baby in mid-April, once they had settled into a bit of a routine and were ready for visitors. April 15th, 1998. Voldemort was growing anxious, which made Richard nervous. The man was barely clinging to the edge of reason as it was, and anxiety only ramped up his manic state. He'd sent wizards out on more missions in the last couple of weeks than ever before, searching for either Muggle-borns or Harry Potter. Richard knew that nearly all Muggle-borns, with the notable exception of Hermione, had either fled the country or were in safe houses, and Potter was hidden away behind the unplottability of the Black House. But it still made him fearful. Everyone's exhaustion was evident. Jugson looked as though he hadn't slept properly in many days, and Lucius's eye twitched uncontrollably. Remarkably, Bellatrix looked much the same as she always did, but seeing as she was always looking as though she were one breath away from spiraling into the abyss, this shouldn't have been very surprising. Worse, the Dark Lord was starting to insinuate that the time was right for Fixer Elixir to turn from innocuous energy drink brand that people trusted to instrument of mass murder. The thought of Voldemort somehow figuring out how to corrupt the supply chain of the drink and poison it kept Richard awake at night. For at least the 1000th time, he wondered why he had ever started this infernal mess. The meeting was wrapping up. Richard stood with the others and prepared to leave, but was stopped by the high, cold voice of Voldemort.
"Richard! I wish to speak to you alone."
His stomach was a cold pit of fear, but he turned back, facing the red-eyed man. Voldemort waited until they were alone to speak.
"I fear we are losing our grip on Wizarding Society. There are underground newspapers publishing untruths about me, renegade groups plotting against me. I have not mentioned it in the meetings with everyone, but the Carrows are facing a lot of resistance at the school. I know that Snape and young Malfoy and your daughter are helping them, but it doesn't seem to be enough."
Richard only nodded, uncertain where Voldemort was going with this.
"I envision a time in the near future when all of us will be called to fight for the betterment of Wizarding Society. I'm glad to know that I can count on the support of you and your daughter. I would hate to think of what would happen to your dear Linda should we fail."
Richard nodded mutely, but inside he was frantic with fear. Never in all their meetings had the man intimated that he would go after Linda if Richard did not succeed. "I understand, cousin," he murmured. Voldemort disapparated, leaving Richard standing alone, forcing his breathing to normalize before he met Lucius to return to his Hampstead home. Back at home in his living room, Richard found the house empty. His nerves were jittery, and to reassure himself that he was alone, he went from room to room, flicking on the lights. When he reached the basement, he entered his private room, retrieving the gun with the silver bullets and holstering it in a shoulder holster. He had expected Linda to be home from yoga by now. Ordinarily at this hour, his wife was already showered and in her pajamas for the night. His fear for her safety only increased as the minutes ticked by and the messages to her mobile went unanswered. He turned off the lights and sat on the sofa to wait. Finally, at 15 minutes after 9, the front door opened quietly. Linda crept by the door of the living room on her way to the staircase, shoes held in hand. "Lindy Hop?" Richard called quietly, flicking on the lights. "Where were you?"
"Oh, Richard, you gave me such a fright. Why were you sitting here in the dark, love?"
Linda asked him. He smiled but didn't answer.
"Yoga tonight?"
Yes," she answered.
"You left your yoga mat at home,"
Richard said quietly, gesturing to the mat near the living room door.
"Ah, yes."
Linda turned and placed her shoes near the front door, then rose to look him in the eye.
"You had tennis tonight, did you not? With Robert?"
He hesitated only for a moment before saying,
"I did."
"Your tennis racket has been in the boot of the car for the last fortnight. I noticed a while back that there was a large hole in it, and I've been meaning to take it to get it restrung." Richard was silent. "So, where have you really been going, Richard?" Linda asked.
"I asked you first, darling," he hedged.
"I was in Cardiff, helping your mother's cousin repair that chicken coop." Richard sucked in a shallow breath. He looked away swiftly, his mind working through every possible equation and coming up with only one answer. She knew. Possibly she had always known. And what's more, apparently she herself was involved in some way.
"You know about me? What I do?"
he asked quietly. "Yes, Richard," she said with a small smile. How long have you known?"
"How long have we been married?" she counted. "I asked your mother, years ago, about the health of her cousin. Turns out your mother doesn't have any cousins in Cardiff. It didn't take long to put it all together. Random mobile phones in the nightstand. You needing to go out of town on late notice. There were times you said you were going to organize the basement, but I would go down and couldn't find you anywhere. And then you would come back upstairs as though nothing were wrong. I knew you weren't seeing anyone, but that wasn't like you. I know you said you received a stipend for injuries from your years in service, but the money in the accounts each month, it seemed like more than just a disability stipend. And with your background, it just fit." He sighed.
"Linda, I never intended to keep you in the dark. I only wanted to keep you safe," Richard said gently. "It was one thing when it was just the regular world, but once I got sucked into this whole wizarding thing with you-know-who—"
"I know, darling. I had to accept that knowledge a long time ago. There are parts of your life that you cannot talk about. But as long as you kept returning to us, I knew you were safe."
"So, how long have you been involved in all of this? What have you been doing?"
"Only since last September. I've been meeting with Tonks and Narcissa on occasion."
Richard smiled to himself. "I knew you hated bowling."
Linda laughed.
"And I knew that Robert moved to Edinburgh years ago. I'm guessing you've been involved in all this a lot longer. You must be the source of the insider information that Tonks has mentioned on occasion. How did it start, by the way? I assume Lucius didn't just ask you to join the Death Eaters and you agreed." "No, if you can believe it. It was this blasted tattoo," he chuckled, gesturing to his arm. "Evidently, it looks enough like his that he assumed I was one of them all this time."
Richard crossed to her and took her arms, putting them around his waist and running his own hands from her shoulders to her back. He lowered his lips to hers, giving her a long kiss. He was glad, now, to finally have no secrets between them.
"Let's go upstairs. We have a lot to discuss, and with any luck we won't fall asleep until I can show you a few of my secret agent gadgets."
He smiled against her forehead. They hurried up the stairs, and when they reached the side of the bed, Richard turned her to face him. He unbuttoned her jacket, sliding it gently from her shoulders. Underneath, she wore a lace-trimmed camisole made of a soft, satiny pink silk. It was almost as luxuriantly supple as her skin, he thought to himself, as he kissed a path from her neck, across one shoulder, and down her arm. She moaned then, reaching her hands under his jacket, startling in surprise when she encountered the holster underneath.
"You don't wear this all the time," she said. "What happened tonight?" "Nothing," he said. "And nothing will happen to you. You're with me now."
She looked up at him with a lazy smile. Well, you are the man with the golden gun," she quipped. He chuckled softly, pushing the thin camisole straps down, letting the fabric pool at her waist. Her bra was off with a quick twist of his fingers, and one pert nipple was in his mouth in an instant. She loved the feel of this man, so solid, encircling her with his heat, with his hunger for her. His hands ran up and down her body as though the next thing he touched was his favorite, as though, if he lost contact with her body for only a moment, she might disappear. "Richard," Linda said, more wantonly than she'd intended, "take this off." She pushed lightly at the holster. He stepped back carefully,
his eyes trained on her as though to fix her in place. He shrugged first one muscular arm, then the other free from the brown leather of the holster. Unsnapping the latch securing the gun, he turned away from her, clicking the gun to drop the magazine from it. Next, he racked the gun and checked the chamber, ensuring that it was not loaded. Then he carefully placed the gun and the magazine down on the dresser, and turned back to her wolfishly. Linda, meanwhile, had shucked off her trousers and the pink camisole, and stood there in the royal blue lace-trimmed knickers that she knew to be one of his favourites. When she'd put them on that morning, she'd smiled to herself, thinking that perhaps he might catch a glimpse of her getting ready for bed tonight, and they'd share a quickie. This, on the other hand, this was shaping up to be a marathon. They fell to the bed together, a frenzied clash of tongues and teeth, hands and arms. In a matter of moments he had shucked his shirt and trousers, his need for her clear from the straining length inside his pants. Richard pulled back, his mouth trailing lower, ready to please her the way she liked, but Linda was far too impatient. She wrapped her hands around the late evening stubble of his jaw, halting his progress. She met his eyes and gave him a wicked little grin of her own. Then she turned over languidly in the bed, folding her legs up under her. She rose up on her hands and knees, arching her back, flipping her hair over her shoulder and raising one eyebrow. Richard took a deep breath, fighting down the urge to split his woman in half with his primal desire for her. He trailed her knickers down her legs, then pushed one hand between her thighs, parting them to make room for him. Reaching up, his warm fingers slipped through her wet quim, and she moaned and pushed back to find her own friction of pleasure. "Oh, fuck. You're so perfect, Linda. So amazing, love." Richard pushed out through gritted teeth, fighting against the need to thrust inside of her. But Linda refused to allow him to hold back. She reached between her legs, finding his warm, solid length. She pumped him urgently, then arched her back forward, pushing her face into the duvet to allow the angle that would bring them both the most gratification. She pulled him to her, placing him at her entrance, then waited. After only a second, Richard could draw out their anticipation no more. He pushed into her wet heat, all the way to the hilt. Both of them moaned at the sudden influx of sensation. Linda's fingers fisted at the coverlet, and Richard's hands grabbed at her hips, pulling her close, pushing himself deeper. They moved together, Linda chasing her release, Richard doing his best to stave off his own. After only a couple of minutes, the squeeze and drag of her orgasm felt like a pinpoint of rapture, deep within Richard's body, and he could prolong it no longer. As he fell over the edge, pumping his seed deep into her, he felt her second orgasm rolling through her body around his cock. They fell to the bed, spent, both breathing hard, not just from exertion, but from wonder at the heady sensations they'd just shared. Gently, he laid one arm across his wife's stomach, pulling her against him. He rolled them over and pulled down the coverlet, dragging it back over the two of them to ward off the cold intrusion of air around their warm bodies. "Here, love," he said, kissing her hair and tucking the coverlet in around her knees. "Let's go undercover together." She laughed. "I always knew I had a spy who loved me." He smiled against her neck. And after he'd had a bit of time to recover, Linda had a spy who loved her not just once, but 3 times. Over the next couple of weeks, they talked nightly, updating each other on what they knew, offering ideas and suggestions to each other. They were getting ready. Ready to defend their right to exist as Muggles. Ready to fight for their daughter and everyone like her. Ready to defeat the Dark Lord once and for all. Thank you for listening to this chapter of The Muggle Death Eater by Great78.